Recently, I made videos on the trainee and Jagan archetypes, and those were some of my favorite videos to make. The Jagan one in particular I think was probably the best video that I have made in my entire YouTube career. As a result, I thought it might be fun to take a look at other archetypes that have been reoccurring throughout Fire Emblem. Now, if you watched my trainees video, you might remember that I asked my friend Akira to do a video on Ests to function as a companion piece to that. And it was a very good video. If you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend you take a look at it. As such, it is admittedly a little bit awkward that the patrons voted for me to cover Ests as my next archetype, but I think I have some things to add to the conversation. Towards the end of Akira's video, they commented that many of the units commonly considered to be Ests don't have too much in common with each other either from a gameplay or story perspective. For example, Zeiss from Fire Emblem 6 starts with either capped or nearly capped strength depending on his hard mode bonuses, as well as an extremely strong 15 defense and 37 HP, and a respectable 13 skill. His 11 speed is a little bit lacking, but the biggest area where Zeiss wants to improve is his weapon rank. In contrast, Nino from Fire Emblem 7 is one-rounded by most physical enemies in her join map, and despite hitting on resistance, she struggles to secure kills without having them set up for her. Her offensive stats also need some work, although her magic and speed growth rates offer the promise of payoff if you're willing to put in the work. Theoretically, both of these units are considered to be Ests, but they share almost nothing in common with each other. Sure, both of them have a relatively high attack growth, but Dosla from Fire Emblem 8 has the same strength growth as Nino's magic, so is he an Est? I mean, of course not. But that leaves us to wonder, what is an Est? Because unlike Oifi, I think that calling a unit an Est is a useful term and can communicate helpful information. So this video isn't going to be so much proving that Ests don't exist, but trying to figure out what actually they are and what we mean when we talk about Ests, because I feel like there's 5 or 6 different definitions floating out there, and if we're talking about different things when we use the same term, it's not especially helpful. But as cool and awesome as I am, I don't think that I have the answers to everything on my own. And as a result, I did a community survey to try to get other people's opinions on the Est archetype and what units are Ests as well. I do want to note that this is not a scientific survey, and it is very possible that the results of this survey do not reflect the larger Fire Emblem community. At time of recording, I have just under 450 responses, and so that is not a great sample size. I think it's enough to get a general idea from, but I can't make any definitive statements with that number. Additionally, there is some amount of inaccuracy inherent to the way that the first question in the survey was structured. The first question in the survey included 45 units, and I asked people to check off which ones they considered Ests. As not everyone has played every game, there are inevitably going to be some units that were not checked off not because someone doesn't believe they're an Est, but because they didn't play the game they're in. I was aware of this limitation going in, and considered the alternative of having each unit have an individual question so that people could skip the question if they hadn't played the game. However, I ultimately decided to make it a single question under the logic that fewer people would respond to a free survey that has over 50 questions than one that only has 9. For the purposes of this video, I felt that the last 8 questions were more important than the first one, so I was willing to accept some amount of error in the first question in order to get more people to answer the last 8. Still, it is worth keeping this limitation in mind whenever we look at data from the first question. We can get a general idea of what units are usually considered to be Ests from it, but we can't know the exact numbers. And it is very possible that there is a margin of error based on more and less popular games. For example, fewer people have played FEs 1, 2, 3, and 4, so the units en masse are probably going to skew lower than units in 3 Houses, or FE7, or Awakening, or other popular games. With that caveat out of the way, let's dive in and try to figure out, what is an Est? Part 1. Defining Est. If you were to ask me to define the Est archetype, I would say that they are an under-leveled late joiner with bad bases but good growths. These are, of course, all very relative terms. and depending on how broad you are with them, could apply to a multiplicity of units. And while I'm personally of the belief that a very rigid view of archetypes is unhelpful, as I explained in my Jagen's video, I do also think that an archetype that could potentially include FE8 Myrrh, FE9 Shannon, and FE10 Peleus all together is perhaps a bit too broad to be helpful. As such, I'm going to try to narrow down these terms. When I say late joining, I typically mean within the last third of the game, although I would be willing to accept within the last half of the game if other qualities of the unit were particularly Est-like. When I say underleveled, I typically think of a unit who joins in a lower class tier than the units you are currently using, whether they be growth units or pre-promotes that just joined. I also tend to think that they are a ways off from promotion, usually 5 or more levels from it. As far as bad bases are concerned, I would consider a unit to have bad bases if they struggle to contribute on their join map and their stats are noticeably lower than the other units in your army, again, both old and new. As far as Est's most defining feature, their good growths, I don't know that there necessarily is nor needs to be a concrete definition of what constitutes good growth rates. Having a very high growth total is certainly an indicator, but does not always tell the complete story, as often having very good growth rates in 1 or 2 key stats can be just as, if not more important. So rather than attach some sort of arbitrary numerical threshold that your growths need to reach in order to be considered an Est, I personally would take the same approach that Supreme Court Justice Stewart took when defining hardcore pornography. I know it when I see it. Now, while I feel confident that that set of traits is at least close to the definition that most commonly is used for Ests, I'm also keenly aware of the fact that the term is used for a wild degree of units, and sometimes it feels like everyone has their own personal definition of what Est means. Hence the survey. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the results now, and as a reminder, not the most scientific process, but it's the best I could do. When asked when Est should join the player, 44% of respondents said within the last half of the game, and 48% of respondents said within the last third of the game, with the remaining 8% saying that join time doesn't matter for the Est archetype. With such an overwhelming majority of people saying at least the back half of the game, I think it is almost undebatable that the Est archetype refers to a late joiner. It is interesting to me that there is such a distinct split between last half and last third, however, as it shows that late joiner can apply to a broad range of units. I think it's fair to say the later a unit joins, the more people would be willing to accept them as an Est, however there is clearly some wiggle room there, and perhaps the more Est-like qualities they have, the more wiggle room that would be allowed by more people. When I asked if Ests should be unpromoted, 74% of respondents said that they believed they should be unpromoted, with 26% saying that they did not necessarily need to be unpromoted. It is worth noting there is some room for error here. As I indicated, a tier 1 class is what I consider to be unpromoted, and some people rightly pointed out to me that in Radiant Dawn, tier 2 class would be considered to be unpromoted instead of tier 1 class. As such, it's possible that some people said no on the grounds of Radiant Dawn alone, although I'm unable to tell how many. Still, it is unlikely that everyone who said no did so specifically because of Radiant Dawn, and as such, it seems likely that about a quarter of respondents thought that unpromoted units and promoted units could both be Ests. I saw a similar split when I asked if people thought that Ests need low base stats. 73% of people said yes, they need low base stats, and 27% of people said no, they do not need low base stats. I'll be honest, this really surprised me. I have always heard Ests referred to as project units, and to me, someone isn't really a project if they are perfectly competent at base. While it is true that a majority of respondents agreed with my thoughts on this matter, over a quarter of them did not. And if you are one of the people who responded they do not need low base stats, please comment below. I'm genuinely curious as to why you feel that way, because it is a mindset that I actually can't understand, and I want to. This is not meant to be shaming you. I don't think that you're wrong. This is obviously an opinion-based survey. I don't think it's possible to be wrong. I disagree with the opinion that you hold. However, I am more confused by it than anything, and I really would like to know how you would define an Est if they have good base stats. Because while growths are often the focus when it comes to Ests, if you're improving on perfection, is it really an improvement? That's just my perspective though. The next question I asked was whether or not Ests need high growths, and I offered 4 options. I said they should have the highest growth total in the game, they should have among the highest growth total in the game, but it doesn't need to be the highest, with an embarrassing typo. Growth total doesn't matter, but important stats should have the highest growths, such as magic and speed. And my final option was that S growths do not matter whatsoever. The responses on this were actually pretty split. 8% of respondents said that they should have the highest growth total in the game, and 5% said that S growths do not matter to the archetype. On the other hand, 59% of people said that they should have among the highest growth total, but it doesn't need to be the highest, and 35% indicated that growth total was less important than growths in specific stats. I tend to value growths in specific stats more than growth total, although I don't think it is necessarily a binary either or, and I would be willing to accept units that fulfill either criteria as Ests if pressed. My next question was whether or not Ests need to be a specific class, and 98% of respondents said that they did not need to be a specific class. I tend to fall in the same boat. I don't consider Est to be a class-based archetype, and in fact I think most class-based archetypes could simply be replaced by saying the class name instead of an archetype name. For example, the Myrrh archetype isn't real, just say mage. However, that is off topic for this video, so I will save that rant for another time, perhaps a future video. The final question we'll talk about in this section of the video is me asking the participants whether there were any other traits that make someone an Est that hadn't been mentioned at any previous point in the survey, and I got a number of very interesting responses, so I want to go over some of my favorites here. But before we do that, I do want to thank each and every person who took time out of their busy day in order to take this survey. I really appreciate it. I read every response, and if yours isn't featured in the video, it's not because it's a bad response, it's because I didn't have time for all of them. I still appreciate them all. Thank you so much. I want to start with a group of story-based attributes that people said they consider a requirement to be an Est. Many people said that Ests tend to be young, some even gave specific age ranges that they need to be in. On a related note, many people said that Ests should be naive to an extent, and that they should be rescued by the player either from capture or from a difficult situation, as is the case with Est in Arcanea, often being in prison when you first find her. Personally, I am of the belief that Est describes units on a gameplay sense, not a story sense, so I don't find any of these to be requirements, but I totally understand that there are some people that view the archetypes as being shared gameplay and story. I also mentioned this in my Jagen's video, but I do want to elaborate on why I personally don't think that gameplay and story archetypes should be combined into a single thing. Within media, archetype simply means a repeated motif or character throughout multiple works. However, when we are talking about archetypes in Fire Emblem, we are often using them as part of a larger conversation. For example, saying X unit is the Jagen is our way of trying to communicate a lot of information through a shorthand. In my experience, when people are having conversation and using archetype terms, they're usually either talking about the gameplay or the story, but typically not both at the same time. For example, if a new player asks for advice approaching early maps, a common piece of advice is don't be afraid to use your Jagen. The Jagen can be very helpful on early maps. If they were asking about Radiant Dawn, and were told that Soth is not actually a Jagen on the grounds that he isn't a mentor, this might steer them away from using him, even though from a gameplay perspective he fulfills the same role as Jagen, Marcus, etc. On the opposite end of things, it would be equally silly to insist that Eldigan's role in the story doesn't align with the Camus archetype just because you are capable of defeating him by clicking the talk command. That's why I personally reject the story requirements out of hand for the Est archetype, as I think that Est is most often used when describing the way that a unit performs. For example, if someone asks how best to use Nino, replying by saying she's an Est, so you're gonna need to put in some work before you see return on investment, is still a valid statement regardless of whether or not you rescue her from prison. I will say this, however, most of the units who I do personally consider Ests are young and naive, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think being young and naive is a requirement for being an Est, but I think it is a role that naturally lends itself to someone who is just training to become a soldier. After all, if they were already a hardened soldier, they would probably have better bases as opposed to really bad ones and good growths. Room to grow in general is an idea that is usually applied to children. Suffice to say, I totally understand where people are coming from with this take, it's just not one that I agree with. Another point that people brought up is that Ests should be very difficult to recruit. For example, Nino is very far away from you on one of the hardest maps in the game. Est herself starts out in a jail cell in FE2 and FE3 and requires you to rescue her before you can use her. Zeiss is locked away in a corner far away from your main goal and all of your side objectives of the treasure room. And Sarah either teleports around the map in order to make it difficult for Leaf to reach her, or waits on a cliff top that he can't reach without the assistance of a warp staff or rescue drop. I will be honest, I don't think that a difficult recruitment is a trait that I would associate with Ests. For example, in Fire Emblem 1 and 11, Est herself just flies in and recruits herself on Myrrh, with no effort required from the player other than keeping Myrrh alive, and I guess not murdering her. On the other end of things, Xavier and Waldus are extremely inconvenient recruitments, and yet I don't think either of them would be considered Ests. It is, however, interesting to me that there are so many examples that have frustrating recruitments or first maps. It really serves to give a bad first impression, especially when coupled with their abysmal base stats. Another point that I saw raised multiple times is that Ests should have some sort of advantage over their peers if they are trained. This could be higher stats, although there are other options. For example, in Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, Delthea has a unique spell in Ragnarok. Well, technically Celica gets that spell as well, but it is unique to Delthea on Alm's army. Other examples of unique payoffs could be specific combat arts in Three Houses, or the ability to triangle attack that is stapled to Est herself. I agree with this sentiment. After all, if there's no payoff to the training project, then they're not really a training project so much as just a bad unit. Usually the payoff is high growth rates, but I find it much more interesting when the payoff is something other than specifically their stats. Stats can often be replicated, but other things can't necessarily. Lastly, I got a variety of opinions on how difficult Est should be to train, with some people saying they should be relatively difficult, and others saying that they shouldn't be too frustrating like Sophia is. Personally, I think there should be some form of challenge in training them. If they're perfectly competent at base, like Cyril and Myrrh, then it doesn't really feel like zero to hero so much as hero to hero. In closing out this section, I do want to once again thank everyone who answered the survey. I really appreciate your response. Even if it wasn't featured here, I did read it and appreciate it. And for anyone whose response I disagreed with, I want to emphasize that these are just opinions. You're not, objectively wrong or anything, and I hope that you don't feel that I'm attacking you, but rather that I disagree with your opinion. Which is okay, we are allowed to disagree. With all of that said, I closed the survey out by asking, do you think that Est is a real archetype? And 83% of people said that they do believe that Est is a real archetype, with only 17% saying no, it is not a real archetype. And I'll be honest, I can understand why so many people say that it's a real archetype. It feels like a real archetype. Even if it's difficult to nail down exactly what makes someone an Est, I don't think it necessarily needs to have a concrete archetype so much as the general idea is something that is commonly shared, so that when we are talking about units and use the term Est, everyone's on the same relative page. Which brings us to a look at the actual units themselves, because as I mentioned earlier in the video, I opened this survey with a list of characters and asked people whether or not they consider them to be Ests. I will be honest, many of the characters that I included, I don't consider to be Ests, but thought that others might. I also included a space for people to write down characters I left off who they consider to be Ests, and well, let's just say there wasn't a whole lot of common consensus about who is and is not an Est. So I want to briefly take a look at all of the characters that I submitted, as well as those that survey respondents submitted, talk about how well I feel that they fit into the Est archetype, or how much of a stretch they are, and very briefly see if we can come up with a concise list of how Esty things are. Yes, it's going to be brief. Please don't look at the timecode down there. I promise this is going to be a short video. Part 2. Definitely an Est. I would hazard a guess for around 80% of people when you hear about the Est archetype, the first unit that comes to mind isn't one of the many iterations of Est, but instead Nino from Fire Emblem 7, the level 5 mage who joins you in Battle Before Dawn. She is hilariously underleveled, boasting base stats that are close to Lucius. However, she has some of the highest growths in the game. Well, kind of. It's not so much that her individual growths are better than the competition, but that her growth total is incredibly high, with everything other than her defense growth hovering around the 50 to 60% mark. Most notably, both her speed and magic are incredibly high. Yes, she has 10% less magic growth than Lucius, but she uses a better weapon type, and she has a better speed growth than him. While personally I consider magic and speed to be her most important growth rates, it is worth noting that her skill, HP, luck, and resistance growths are also very respectable, again hovering around the 50% mark. And as such, I think we can say with a high degree of certainty that Nino has good growths, bad bases, and a low level for her join time. The proposal given to you by the game, as is usually the case with Ests, is here is a very weak unit, but if you train her, you'll get rewarded with someone stronger than the rest of your mages. But does this hold up to scrutiny? When comparing a 15-1 promoted Sage Nino to the 15-1 promoted versions of the other mages, I find that she had marginally better stats, but not in a way that significantly mattered. She had 17 speed, whereas both Urk and Lucius had 14, and Lucius actually had 16 magic in comparison to Nino's 13, whereas Nino's 13 was higher than Urk's 11. When looking at the other stats, it was close to the same story as well. 13 skill in comparison to 14 skill, 7 defense in comparison to 8 defense. Nino has a lead over the others, but not by much. The biggest area that is a standout for her is 14 luck, which is double that of Urk's and even more impressive in comparison to Lucius's pathetic 4. However, luck is often memed on as a dump stat, down there with resistance and skill, so I don't necessarily know that this is a great argument for training her. But what's even more damning is the comparison to Pent, the pre-promoted sage you got several chapters prior to Nino. Across the board, his stats are better. Nino technically ties him in speed, but the constitution difference means that functionally she is slower than him, and everything else she has lower stats in as well. Well, except for luck. I guess that's a good win for her. But hey, most of my audience probably already knows that Pent is better than Nino. I mean, heck, I probably don't even need to sell people on the idea that Est units in general tend to perform poorly. However, it is worth pointing out that I wouldn't call units like this bad design. It's easy to throw up an Oifibot stat screen and say that the reward isn't worth the training arc. However, what you're missing in that argument is that the reward is the training arc. For people who enjoy using Nino and other similar units, the dopamine rush of seeing their stats go up is the reward you get. Watching this unit who otherwise would be pathetic take on endgame level enemies is all the reward you need. Sure, you could have done it easily and probably even better with Pent, but you did it with Nino, and that's the fun part. Interestingly, there's an argument that Fire Emblem 7 wants you to make use of Nino as well, as she has several story appearances before her recruitment, and is force deployed on 2 separate maps, that being her join map and the Gaiden that follows. This is a trait that is only shared by the other lords and your dancer. And if that topic interests you, friend of the channel Eat Your Greens has made an entire video about it, which will be linked in the description below. But for our purposes, the most important thing to be said about Nino is she is the spitting image of an Est, which is why it shouldn't surprise anyone that she had the single highest number of votes in the poll at 90%. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the missing 10% were just people who didn't vote for her because they hadn't played Fire Emblem 7, or maybe a couple of people who wanted to be contrarian about it. The only units who scored even close to this were the 6 iterations of Est herself, and well, since I brought up Est, I guess now is as good a time as any for my first controversial statement of the video. Part 2.5. Est is not an Est. Okay, it's not that extreme. I do think that under a broad enough definition, several iterations of Est could fit in the Est archetype. However, I don't think I would ever place them in a point where they are definitely an Est. And that is weird, because she's the unit the archetype is named after, right? Well, she may be the person who it's named after, but my theory is that she's not the person who the archetype is modeled after. That would be Nino. My theory is that upon noticing the repeated tropes such as Jagan characters and red and green cavaliers, Western fans went looking for other repeated tropes, which is how the archetypes were formed. In the case of the Est archetype, people saw that Est was a late joining unpromoted unit with worse bases than people who joined several chapters prior to her, and compared it to Nino because naturally she's in the same position. It makes sense on a surface level, but I do think there are 2 qualities of FE1 Est that were overlooked. The first is that while her growths look absolutely bonkers from a GBA perspective, in comparison to FE1 units, they are, well, they're still great, but they're not as bonkers as it might first appear. She has 70% in all of the important stats, that being strength, speed, and weapon level, and high growths in all of the other ones as well. However, 60, 70, or 80 are the baseline for what would be considered good growths in Fire Emblem 1. Katria having 80% speed, Myrrh having 70% luck, etc, etc. The fact that Ests has 70% in all of her stats is definitely notable, but it's held in check by a couple of other aspects of FE1 jank. First off, stat boosters give insane amount of stats. Secondly, and more importantly for Ests, however, is that the experience formula is fixed. You don't gain more or less experience depending on your level in comparison to the enemy's level. Instead, every enemy gives you the same amount of experience, for chip and kills. This means that whether Ests is level 3 or Jagen is level 19, they will both get the same amount of experience for killing the same enemy, which really undermines her effectiveness as a training project. The last is that all stats cap at 20, meaning that her amazing growths kind of just help her catch up to where everyone else is going to land anyway. And all of this holds true for FE3 Book 1 as well. Her amazing growths are unchanged, but so are the things that make her not really function as a growth unit. It is also worth noting that Ests is not alone in being a weaker version of a unit you already got. Navarre is a weaker version of Ogma, and then in follow, Rad and Caesar are weaker versions of the two of them. If you accidentally killed off Gordon, you can take Tomas as a replacement. And if for whatever reason you benched Cain and Abel, Roche and Violent are here to fill in their shoes. In interviews, Kaga has said that he meant for these various replacement units to fill in the role of what I would describe as Iron Man filler units. He believed that people would not reset for lost units, and as a result, he gave you worse versions of the ones you started out with, so you would still have someone to fill your army, but you would be punished a little bit. You can use Dolph instead of Doga, and Dolph is worse in every single way, but that's because you fucked up and killed Doga. You shouldn't kill Doga. Don't mess with Doga. It is therefore very possible that Ests was meant to be your replacement for Pala, Katria, or Minerva if you got them killed. After all, Marth is the one who recruits her rather than her sisters, which is a little bit weird when you think about it. Still, these are the units who are probably closest to the Est archetype aside from Nino, and on a second look, I do think they probably belong in the definitely an Est category, an honor that I would not extend to their FE11 counterpart. Shadow Dragon DS Remake did this really weird thing where it cut unit growths almost universally in conjunction with powering up enemy stats. This made it so that your entire team tends to be weaker in comparison to the enemy from both directions. I suspect that the reason the growth rates were cut was to put them more in line with the Tellius or GPA level of growth rates, as the ones in FE1 were much closer to Awakening level in some degrees. However, these cuts were not made evenly, and Ests is particularly poorly hit, with her growth rates suffering so much that she actually has weaker growths than Katria in almost every category. She has 20% less HP and skill growth, 10% less speed growth, 5% less defense growth, with her only victory being a measly 10% strength and 10% luck. That's in conjunction with later join time and lower bases, as is to be expected of an Est, but the lower growths kind of makes me think, yeah, she's not an Est, she's a replacement unit. We see a similar story in FE12, although not to the same degree. Instead of Est having lower growth than Katria, she just ties them in most respects, although notably she does have a 30% strength growth lead. I don't know if this is enough to say that she is the growths unit when everything else is basically tied with her sister, but it is at least a better argument than the FE11 version. And then we get to the Valentian games, and Valentia is very weird for growth units. Normally the saying is that bases are better than growths. However, in Valentia, it's class bases over growths, because when you promote, even if your stats suck, you just get zoinked up to class bases. And for most units, class bases are good enough that the majority of their stats will get raised to class bases. This means that high growth units are in a weird place where their high growths are kind of not valued. Interestingly, the biggest thing that Ests brings to the table is her base resistance, because in Fire Emblem 2, there's 0% resistance growth on all of your units, meaning that she has the highest resistance in the game and will always have the highest resistance in the game at 12. She does also technically have the highest growth rates of the White Wings, But like, it's not by such a significant margin. The biggest one is the 50% defense. Everything else is pretty close to her sisters, and she actually has less speed growth than Catria once again. Even Paula is able to say that she ties her in the strength growth department. So yeah, it really is just bulk, but both from the physical and magical side. So good job, Est, I guess? You're a tank now? Unfortunately, that victory does not carry over into the remake, and hilariously, both of Est's sisters just have better growth than her basically across the board. Paula has more strength and HP than her, Catria has more speed than her, and while Est does have the highest luck, defense, and resistance growths, those are not by significant margins. In combination with class bases patching up weak points, the biggest thing that Est brings to the table is her resistance stat, which remains at a base of 12. I think with the exception of DS Shadow Dragon, this is the iteration of Est that least lives up to her namesake category. Sure, I guess she has a lower level than her sisters, so there's more room to grow, but like, that argument is also used for Ross, and it doesn't make him an Est either. For those who are curious, this is where I would rank the various iterations of Est on an Estness scale. I've labeled the ones that have similar sprites to each other with numbers so you can tell them apart. But the only two Ests that I think are definitely an Est are FE1 and FE3. Although, in fairness, FE3 is both Book 1 and Book 2, so it's kind of like two units in the shape of one. But I've said the word Est so many times that it feels like it's losing all meaning, so let's focus back in on trying to fill that top tier off with someone else who I think is definitely an Est. Still in part 2, because we're doing Final Fantasy naming schemes, Miranda is an Est. Miranda was a unit who did not get that many votes on my Est poll. However, I blame this partially on the fact that many people have not played Thracia 776. Miranda is a level 5 mage who joins you about 2/3 of the way through the game with pretty abysmal bases. However, she has a crucial 70% magic growth and 70% speed growth, meaning that her level ups will be huge. Not only that, but if you train her to promotion, she becomes a mage knight, and therefore gets a horse in a game where Kanto is incredibly broken. When comparing her to the other mages, Asvel and Homer have very good speed growths, but these are offset by the fact that their magic growths are only mediocre. I wouldn't say that they have bad magic growths at 40 and 35% each, but they are not nearly as good as the 70% that Miranda offers. Linoan, on the other hand, is more balanced, with 45 magic and 55 speed, and Salem has 30 magic and 40 speed, so none of them come close to the 70-70 split that we get from Miranda. Now, it is worth noting that there are several aspects of Thracia's game design that make it so that Miranda's position as an Est is significantly less impressive than it would be otherwise. First off, the existence of scrolls means that you can fix low growth rates. Asvel may only have a 35% magic growth, but you can give him scrolls to supplement that and push them up to very respectable numbers. Sure, you can give those scrolls to Miranda when she arrives as well, but Asvel will have been growing with very high growth rates for a long time before she shows up, so the aspect of training her to get someone who is only as good as Asvel is not that appealing. Especially when you consider the fact that Thracia is a 20 cap game. In later Fire Emblems, one of the selling points of Ests is that they can hit caps that few other units can. However, due to the existence of scrolls and the fact that all of the caps are very low, Asvel is going to cap out often before you get Miranda, to be honest. And Asvel's just the best example. Even if for some reason you're not using him, Salem, Homer, and Linoan all have chances to cap out their stats as well. They might not do it before Miranda joins, but they will probably do it before she is capable of it. And while none of them get horses on promotion, they do still get to benefit from the massive Sage promotion gains, which gives 5 magic, 5 skill, 6 speed, 4 defense, and 1 constitution. I don't feel the need to belabor the point any more than I already have. Miranda is definitely the worst option among your mages. However, her incredibly high growths and incredibly low level mean that she does qualify as definitely an Est. I mean, she's got higher speed and magic growths than all of the other mages in the game, right? Oh, there's someone I'm forgetting about, isn't there? Okay, well, I mean, sure, Sarah has an 80% in magic and an 80% in speed, but maybe the game just has 2 Ests, right? She has Paragon, and she's unpromoted, so she must also be an Est, right? Part 3. Stop calling characters who are strong at base Ests. Sarah is a unit who I frequently see described as an Est. She only got 27% on the survey, but that is almost as high as Miranda, and she would also suffer from the Thracia problem, so I think that it is fair to assume that a decent number of Thracia players consider Sarah to be an Est. On the surface, I can see how this might be the case. Much like Miranda, she joins as an unpromoted unit about 2/3 of the way through the game. She has 80% in both magic and speed, so she boasts massive growths, and she has the Paragon skill, which is usually a signifier of a growth unit. Late game, growth unit, unpromoted, these are all the telltale signs of an Est, so why am I saying that she's not an Est? The answer lies in her base stats. Sarah has 11 magic, 9 luck, and 12 skill, all of which are very relevant stats to mages. 11 magic means she's more than halfway to the magic cap, and this is before factoring in the promotion gains that she gets. She's 3 levels away from a sage promotion, which boosts her magic to 17. Even without factoring in the promotion bonus, her magic stat and speed stat are both quite good for that point in the game, and 12 skill is basically perfect. You see, Sarah has access to B rank staves at base, and staves in Thracia have the capability of missing if your staffer has less than 10 skill. Most other staffers start out with less than 10 skill, in fact a lot less than 10 skill, considering that 10 is halfway to the cap. Sarah's base stats mean that she will never miss when staffing, so she is incredibly competent at her most important job at base. And hey, she's only 50 staff uses away from being able to use warp. Fewer uses if she uses more expensive staves, in fact. That said, she's not just a staffer, she can use every school of magic other than dark, and is quite competent at being a glass cannon. She does only have 14 HP and she has a 0 defense stat, but those are not stats that are going to get fixed by growing. 40% HP growth and 10% defense growth, yeah no, she's just supposed to be a frail mage. She's not an Est because her defense is bad. A lot of mages have bad defense. Yes, Sarah is the last unpromoted unit you get, and she joins 1 or 2 chapters after Ralph, the pre-promoted hero. However, it's not like she joins super far after other unpromoted characters. Depending on your route split choice, Linoan will join 2 or 3 chapters before Sarah, Edda and Homer will join 3 or 4 chapters before Sarah, and Sloof will join only 1 chapter before Sarah. In contrast, Heath, Farina, and Wrath are the last unpromoted units to join before Nino, and there are several chapters between them. Additionally, each of those units joins just about ready for their promotion item. Like, seriously, Sloof joins 1 chapter before Sarah, and he is a level lower than her. How is she an Est? Thracia just has an unbalanced cast. You get unpromoted people much later than you would expect to. The same is true of Revelations, and from my survey results, most people don't tend to think that the late joiners in that game are Ests. I think that the Paragon and big growth signal to people that this is supposed to be an investment unit, but honestly she is completely competent at base, and as a result I don't think you can call her an Est. The most she needs is 3 levels, but honestly she probably doesn't even need that. A unit who does probably need 3 levels, however, is Zeiss. He joins you as an unpromoted level 7 Wyvern Knight in Chapter 16 of Fire Emblem 6. His 60% strength growth is definitely impressive, but the rest of his growths don't really stand out that much. And Zeiss is far from the only unit in the Binding Blade to have a lopsided growth spread. Gonzalez also boasts 60% attack, and he has a higher speed growth than Zeiss does as well, at 50% compared to Zeiss's 35%. The main point that I'm trying to make is that Zeiss's growths are kind of average for Fire Emblem 6, and so if Ests are supposed to be these omega growth units, he definitely isn't one. But there's another reason why he's not one, and that's the fact that he often joins with capped strength. Hard mode bonuses make this variable, but Zeiss will start with either 19 or 20 strength, 15 or 16 defense, 13 or 14 skill, and 11 or 12 speed. Those are kind of absurd numbers. To put things into perspective, the pre-promoted General Douglas joins in the next map, and Zeiss will match or exceed his attack and skill, exceed his speed, and be just shy of his defense. Now, Douglas is not considered to be a super top tier unit, but he is a pre-promote, and if you are an unpromoted unit with stats that match that of a pre-promote joining around the same time, like, are you really under-leveled? Technically he is, but the level 7 is just that. It's just the level. His level doesn't actually reflect his competency as a unit. Base Zeiss's combat is quite good. The point that most people seem to criticize him on is that he has accuracy issues, but this is no fault of his own. This is just weapon hit rate problems. Most of the accuracy you get in Fire Emblem comes from your weapon, not from your stats. 13 skill is actually still pretty good for the point of the game where Zeiss joins. He is stuck at D rank lances, which is the unfortunate part, meaning he can't use killer weapons, the most accurate variant of lances. However, once he promotes, he gets killer lances and iron swords, both of which go a long way towards patching up his accuracy problems. He's not going to consistently see 100% in every combat, but neither is any unit in Fire Emblem 6. Like, everyone has accuracy problems in this game, unless your name is Lou or Lilina, aka the two unpromoted anima mages. Oh wait, there's a third unpromoted anima mage. That's Hugh, the unpromoted unit who joins in the same chapter as Zeiss and has worse stats and better growths than him. Why do people say that Zeiss is an Est? It blows my mind! Hugh's stats are variable depending on how much money you're willing to spend. However, even if you pay for the most expensive version of Hugh, he will have significantly less magic than Zeiss's strength, significantly less defense than Zeiss, and all of that for a 1 speed advantage. Zeiss even has 2 more skill than Hugh, once again emphasizing the idea that weapon accuracy is what contributes to your hit rate more than anything else. Honestly, Zeiss might be one of the most underrated units in the series, and definitely within Fire Emblem 6. His base stats are phenomenal, and his accuracy problems as they exist are shared by everyone else who uses lances, which is a lot of very good units. I mean, Shanna and Marcus are pretty good, right? Another unit I frequently hear referred to as an Est is Myrrh from the Sacred Stones, and I kinda get it with this one. She has over 100% in both HP and defense growths, and the rest of her growths are pretty good with the exception of luck and resistance. Additionally, her base stats on their own are single digit, which, yeah, I mean, that fits the low bases, high growths lifestyle. That would be an Est, right? Well, her base stats on their own are not actually the entire picture, because she uses Dragonstones, which significantly boost those stats when equipped. She gains a whopping 12 strength, 12 skill, 15 defense, and 20 resistance from her weapon. Additionally, the weapon itself has 16 might, and deals effective damage to monsters, which make up the majority of the units for the remainder of the campaign. Yeah, it's basically like she's using a PRF legendary weapon. Technically, she does have a bit of a training arc, because at base she's held back by the low HP total. However, after 2 or 3 levels, she is competent enough to just throw herself into a group of enemies. And I can't really say the same about any other Est in the series. Big numbers go ding ding ding, and you do get the dopamine from her, so I understand why people say it, but I think it is way too much of a stretch. She's not competent at base, but she's competent at like level 4. From looking at the results of my poll, it appears that most people are in agreement with me about Myrrh, so maybe there's just a vocal minority that refers to her as an Est. Hopefully it's also only a vocal minority that refers to her as a Goto. On the topic of Gotos, I got a surprising number of people who listed Vale and Mavier as Ests, and I just don't understand this one. I'll start with Vale. She's the last unit to join your army and comes as a level 35 Fell Child, with 26 magic, 23 speed, 20 strength, and 24 dexterity, meaning that she can do a decent amount of damage as a hybrid attacker. 17 defense and 35 HP are definitely incredibly frail, but her growths aren't exactly high in these areas either. It's the Sarah conundrum again. There's a glass cannon, and 2 of her stats are low, therefore she must be an Est even though those growth rates are not good enough to make up for the low stats. But unlike Sarah, Vale joins at an incredibly high level. She's 5 levels from capping. Like, how is this unit supposed to be an Est? You literally have to spend a second seal on her to get more than 5 level ups. I don't understand the logic. I really don't. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Speaking of which, Mavier. I don't understand the logic here either. He starts as a level 12 Royal Knight with an internal level of 20. Saphir joins 2 chapters earlier as a level 7 warrior with an internal level of 19. This is consistent. Like, the units go up in level as you get later into the game is generally what you expect. He has a higher internal level than her and a higher level in his promoted class than her. His stats are higher. He has capped build. He has 21 strength, 23 magic, 25 dex. What is his weak point? Like 16 luck, I guess? He's in a bad class. Like, he's in the Royal Knight class, which is a bad class. So I guess you train him by giving him a second seal and sending him into a good class, like Griffin? I don't understand. How is Mafia an Est? Like, his growths aren't even that good. They're just fine. They're average. 45% strength, 55% magic. If you look at his personals, it's 35 strength, 40 magic. Like, he's just okay. He's a hybrid unit. He's a pre-promote. What do you want from me? How is this guy an Est? What are you training him towards? I want to check back in on the theoretical S tier list that I was working on earlier in the video. I still only have 3 members of the definitely an S tier, and nobody in probably an Est. If an archetype only has 3 units that fit it without stretching to some degree, I would wonder whether or not we can consider it to be an archetype. And this has kind of been the inevitable conclusion of this video, which might lead you to wonder why it is that I opened the video by saying that I believe Est is a real archetype. Well, there are 2 reasons for that. One of them will have to wait until later in the video, but it's time for me to reveal my first nefarious secret reason behind the fact that I said Est is a real archetype. Part 4. This video has secretly been ROM hack propaganda all along. So, in general, archetypes tend to be a lot more concrete in ROM hacks than they are in mainline games. You can argue about Guy versus Raven all you want, but nobody's going to say that Vim isn't the Navarre archetype of 4 kings. And the reason for this is that mainline games tend to not intentionally design most of the archetypes. Jagans tend to be the only ones that are reliably intentionally designed, and that's because they serve such a fundamental gameplay purpose, such that their absence is actually felt in the few titles that don't feature a real Jagan. On the other hand, ROM hacks are usually made by people entrenched in the Fire Emblem fandom community, and as a result, they often intentionally design units to fit into the fandom's pet archetypes. This is relevant for a lot of the edge case archetypes, but I think it is most relevant of all for Ests, because Ests are incredibly fun to use, and most ROM hackers want their games to be fun. As a result, almost every notable ROM hack has an Est character, and most of them are very clearly signaled, so there's no debating whether or not they're an Est, although Fire Emblem fans find a way. ROM hack Ests are incredibly cool in that they manage to push the boundaries of the Est design space, showing off different ways that one can make the Zero to Hero late game unit feel cool. Josie from Call of the Armor starts about 2/3 of the way through the game, however she has a personal brave weapon and incredibly good growths, and is statted to such a degree that she can actually perfectly finish off enemies who have been chipped down by your Jagan wielding the S-rank bow. Being one of very few flyers available certainly helps her prospects, and there's enough of the game left that if you spend 2 chapters training her, she will contribute to your army in a great way. Seer, on the other hand, joins with only 4 chapters remaining, including her join map. However, her growths are incredibly bonkers, and the bonuses she gets from her Dragonstones mean that arguably she's not even really an Est, in the same way that I don't consider Myrrh to be one. It only takes her a few levels to get to the point where enemies will be dealing 0 damage to her unless they use dragon effective weapons. This also makes for an incredibly fun and rewarding unit to use. You put the effort in and you get the god out. On the other end of the spectrum, Emily from 4 Kings is described by the hack's creator as an Est with a capital E and potentially even a joke character. She's an Armor Knight whose recruitment requires going out of the way on a late game escape all map, meaning that she not only slows down your other units getting to the escape point, but now you have to move a low move Armor Knight to the escape point as well. Her personal weapon is 1-2 range and gives the Wary Fighter effect, however she's frequently getting one-shot, so preventing doubling doesn't necessarily help train her. If you do choose to undergo the arduous training arc, she has 60% in most of her growths, which is pretty good. However, the real reward comes when you promote her, cause she goes from being an Armor Knight to a Master Knight, giving her a horse, B rank in all 4 physical weapon types, a massive boost to all of her stats, and especially her magic stat. While it is true that her gains are not as impressive as the FE4 Master Knight promotion gains, and at the end of the day she's probably not worth the effort if you care purely about beating the game, she is absolutely fun to train, and the Master Knight promotion is a good incentive for anyone as lizard-brained as me. But of course, if we're going to talk about ROM hack Ests, then mentioning Sigrid is almost mandatory. She joins you with only 5 chapters left in the game as an unpromoted monk at level 5 with Paragon, Nutso growths, and a PRF Brave Tome, which is the only Brave Tome in the game. While the map that she joins on is a fairly trivial warp skip even if you care about all of the side objectives, the following one is not. It is a 13-turn defend map with a turn floor, and such maps are often perfect for training under-leveled units, so if you want to use Sigrid, this is kind of the time to do so. Now, full disclosure, I think that Sigrid is the worst unit in Vision Quest, and I don't think it's particularly close. However, I also don't think that matters, because the point of Sigrid isn't to be an incredibly strong unit in any way, shape, or form. The point is that you want to train her. It's about the journey, not the destination. If you want to train an Est, she has Paragon, she'll get a bunch of growths on every level up, and she's one of only 3 units who is capable of one-rounding the final boss without stealing his Iron Rune. Technically speaking, almost every unit in the game is capable of one-rounding the final boss, however most of these require setups that involve stealing the Iron Rune from him so that you can rig a crit. Sigrid instead takes advantage of his lower resistance to quad him with capped magic using her Brave Tome. One thing that is notable about Vision Quest is there is a secret shop with incredibly cheap stat boosters. And while this does kind of take away from Sigrid's big growths a little bit, since you can cap out almost any unit in the game this way with enough money, it does mean that you don't need to train her to 2020 in order to ensure that he's able to one-round the boss. Instead, she only needs to get to level 10 and promote, therefore you can use energy rings to reach the magic cap of Bishop, and speed wings to reach the speed cap to ensure that she's quadding. Beyond these 3 examples, almost every ROM hack out there has an Est unit, and some of them are downright goofy in their designs, but like in a good way goofy. So if you're a fan of the Est archetype and enjoyed training Nino to 2020 so she can fight the Fire Dragon, I implore you to check out ROM hacks because there's some great Esting to be done there. I mean, heck, I would even say that the reskin hack Oops All Archers turns La Rochelle into an Est, as it gives her Gale Force and makes her a low-statted combat unit. I mean, I guess there's a few people who refer to La Rochelle as an Est in vanilla, but it can't be that many, right? Oh no. Part 5. Why I don't think staff bots can be Ests. So, when I made my survey, I included quite a few units who I personally do not consider to be Ests, but who I hear referred to as Ests on a frequent basis, such as FE8 Myrrh, FE9 Valencia, or FE10 Peleus. My intention was to get a general feel for how the community views these units, and whether or not they would be labeled as Ests by the average Fire Emblem consumer. Now, unfortunately when making the poll, I forgot to add La Rochelle as an option, so I can't get a feel for how many people actually consider her to be an Est, but considering that I got no less than 10 written responses saying that I had forgotten La Rochelle and that she is an obvious Est, I think it's fair to assume that at the very least a vocal minority of Fire Emblem fans believe La Rochelle to be the Est of FE8, and I'll be honest, I've heard it before and it doesn't really sit well with me. Sure, she's an underleveled unit who joins in the mid-game, at a time where you're getting pre-promotes such as Dosla and Dusel, but like, she's not alone in that role. In both routes she joins a chapter before Ewan, and in Ephraim route she actually joins a chapter before Marissa as well, and both of those are units who are incredibly underleveled for the time that they join. Additionally, Tana and Amelia will both join 2 chapters before La Rochelle. Like, there's no denying that she's underleveled, but I think this is a symptom of the fact that FE8 really wants you to use the Tower of Valny. You just get a lot of units in the mid-game who are crying out for some grinding. On that topic, La Rochelle's not even a unit who's especially easy to grind, as she's stuck on staff experience, meaning that her low level doesn't translate to extra experience. Her inability to do combat removes what is, to my mind, one of the fundamental attributes of an Est, the accelerated experience gains leading to faster growth. This fact alone makes me think that generally staff-locked late-joining units really shouldn't be considered Ests, which is why I consider Charlo and Corporal not to be Ests either. Granted, they have a slightly better case than La Rochelle since they are not surrounded by people at a lower fucking level than them, but still, I don't think that they can qualify as Ests due to the lack of accelerated experience gain. I mean, I guess Charlo does have accelerated experience gain in Paragon, but even then, like, I don't know. It's a pretty big stretch, which is where I'm going to place him on the S tier list if we want to check back into where everyone ended up. You'll notice that it's still mostly only the lower tiers that are filled out, which is why you may be inclined to think that it is a bit of a cop-out answer for me to say that Ests are real but only in ROM hacks. And yes, if that were the main point of my video, it definitely would be a cop-out answer, and possibly clickbait, although I don't think I'm going to put Ests are real in the thumbnail. Instead, I'm going to undermine the entire first half of this video by saying that finding a definition for Ests isn't actually all that important. Well, I mean, it kind of is, but it's slightly more complicated than that. It comes down to the way that we as a community often use archetypes as shorthand for complex ideas. For example, I was recently talking to a friend who just started playing Radiant Dawn. He expressed frustration at how underpowered his army was in Chapter 1-1, and I reassured him by letting him know, don't worry, you'll get your Jagan character partway through 1-2. While calling Soth a Jagan doesn't communicate everything about him as a unit, it gets the idea of a pre-promoted crutch character who is good in the early game across much faster than just saying that would. And these verbal shortcuts are incredibly useful because the Fire Emblem community absolutely loves discussing Fire Emblem. If you want to have a conversation comparing the design approaches of Gifka, Athos, and Flavia, it is much faster to say Go Toad than it is to say late game pre-promote functioning as an anti-softlock feature. While these three units are very different from each other from a design perspective, they do all fit very nicely into the Goto archetype, in a way that units like FE12 Lena do not. Now, if you wanted to be incredibly strict about the Goto definition, you would discount Flavia for not appearing on the final map, and Gifka for not being especially good against the final boss. However, neither of these definitions really functions appropriately if your intent is for archetypes to function as shortcuts for complex ideas, and personally, I think that is the best use of archetypes. So, with all of that in mind, the rather vague definition I began the video with, of an underleveled late-game growth unit, is probably more appropriate than anything more specific we could come up with. I think the ease with which it slots into conversation is well worth the trade-off of including some units that I personally don't consider to be Ests, such as Jesse, Shinon, or Cormag. Wait, Cormag? Flane? Wait, what is going on here? What are some of these units?
Is this some kind of twisted joke?
I want to begin by genuinely thanking everyone who responded to the S survey. You made this video possible, and even if I disagree with your personal opinions on archetypes, it is just video games, and so it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Thank you again for responding to the survey. However, there were definitely some responses that made me confused, I guess would be the right word for it. While the survey included plenty of units that I don't consider S myself, but I can see the arguments for, the insert other comments included a lot of units that I honestly don't understand the argument for why they are Ests. Like, I've struggled to come up with a definition of Est that is simultaneously helpful for expressing the idea and also capable of including all of these units, and I'm failing to come up with one. If you are one of the people who submitted one of the units I talk about in this section, and you want to explain your reasoning for why they ended up there, I would very much appreciate a comment about it, because I am genuinely curious. Even if I disagree, I want to know the reasoning, because at the end of the day, this channel is about talking about Fire Emblem stuff, and I welcome other people's opinions on Fire Emblem stuff. That being said, this upcoming section is absolutely going to be about why I think some of the units that were submitted here are just baffling. In order to make this video not a million hours long, I only included units who got 3 or more submissions with their name, but that's still a large number of units, including, for some reason, Hortensia? I know that discussions around Engage meta are kind of all over the place and still developing, but still, Hortensia being an Est is something that I just can't wrap my mind around. The only thing that she has in common with Est herself is riding Pegasuses and low base stats, but even that isn't necessarily accurate. Like, she has pretty pathetic bulk, but on Maddening mode, most units are getting 2-rounded regardless of their bulk. Her magic isn't great, but her speed is passable, and also, the more important thing, she doesn't need stats to accomplish her primary role. She is the best staffer in the game, and, she fulfills that role at base without needing or wanting any training. Big personality means that all of her staffs are like Festals. Her personal class means that she is able to use movement staffs while flying and having 6 move, and big personality boosts the range of those movement staffs, making her movement even better. Remember, staves don't scale off of magic and Engage, so it's not like leveling up her magic stat is going to do a bunch for you. And she doesn't even really have a high magic growth. It's 35% in her base class. The only real payoff that comes from training her is World Tree at level 5, which is a chance-based activation to conserve a staff use. This definitely feels good, and it does mean that she will conserve on average 1 use of warp per staff, which is nice. However, it's really not the reason that you use her. It is a nice bonus on top, but many high-level playthroughs have demonstrated that World Tree doesn't need to proc at all for you to have as many staff uses as you need. Honestly, I think it takes more than being a mid to late joining Pegasus rider to qualify as an Est, which is a criticism that also applies to Cyrene and Juno, 2 units who were also submitted by several people. I'm once again not entirely sure what to make of these submissions. They're definitely low statted, but they join as pre-promotes and they have kind of pathetic growth rates. Even if you wanted to train these units, there's not really a payoff to doing so. They're just bad units. Just because they're a Falconite doesn't make them an Est. I think an Archetype is more than just a unit class. Otherwise, we would just refer to them by their unit class. The last Falco I'm going to talk about in this section is Radiant Dawn Sigrun, and she has a slightly stronger case than the other 2, but I still don't think she's an Est. She joins at a lower level than Sigrun in the same map, but at about par where you would expect your units to be level-wise. 16 in Tier 2 is not an unreasonable place for someone on your squad. Her stats are slightly tragic, with 20 strength and 23 speed, and she will struggle to do combat against enemies on her join map. However, that's not going to be fixed by training her, at least not to a huge degree, because while her growths are respectable, they're not through the roof. 55% strength and 40% speed are okay, I suppose. I'm not unhappy about them, but they're also not so worth celebration that I would consider her to be an Est. It's also worth noting that, her base stats are not even significantly lower than Sigrun's. It's by 1 or 2 points in most stats, and Sigrun even has 2 less points of strength. The 3-level difference is only really important for being able to pump 200 bonus experience into her and promote her to get promotion gains, but I don't know. Do you really want to spend bonus experience on Sigrun? They're both just kind of filler units for a couple of maps. I wouldn't consider Tanith to be more of a project than any of the other under-leveled and filler units that Radiant Dawn throws at you. Whoops, I guess I lied, because I just realized Marcia was also submitted, by 5 people nonetheless, and I also don't think she's an Est. Her growths aren't better than Tanith's, they're just distributed differently, and not even necessarily distributed better. So basically everything I said about Tanith applies to Marcia, with the caveat that Marcia is available in Alincia's army as opposed to Ike's army. I mean, technically, Marcia is available at the same time that Tanith and Sigrun join, but you're not using her, are you? I guess there is an argument to be made that she's incredibly underleveled when she joins Ike's army, and therefore you could consider her an S due to increased experience gain, but I personally just don't see it because she doesn't have good growths. They're good, but they're not blow you out of the water good. They're not better than average. They are incredibly usable growths by Radiant Dawn standards, however they do not stand out amongst the other units who have incredibly usable growths by Radiant Dawn standards. Of course, someone who was submitted that has growths that stand out on Radiant Dawn standards is Lyre, but they don't stand out for being good. Her growths are pretty bad, actually. 35% strength and 20% defense are downright pathetic. I think the idea was that these growths are supposed to be somewhat supplemented by the fact that Thanks to transformation bonuses, she's gaining 2 points every time she gains 1, which is definitely nice, but it doesn't do anything to help her, especially not with her base strength and defense of 7. Now, her speed is a 70% growth rate, which is definitely a very high growth even by Radiant Dawn standards, but it's also not uncommon for Radiant Dawn units to have very lopsided growths, and 1 or 2 areas where they have extremely high growth rates. For example, Har, a unit who is known for his bases, has a 70% strength growth, a 70% skill growth, and a 65% defense growth. These are counteracted by a pathetic 30% speed growth and a 20% resistance growth that doesn't actually matter. In addition to having bad growths, Lyre is just like not a late joiner. Like, she technically joins about halfway through the game, but that's only because of an army split. Everyone else in Ike's army also joins halfway through the game, but like, you wouldn't say that Ike or Titania are late joiners, would you? I'd think of it in the same way that I think of Genealogy's Generation 1 and 2 split. Seliph starts at the beginning of Generation 2, and Generation 2 is sort of like the availability curve for him, rather than including Gen 1 and Gen 2. Simultaneously, I look at Ike's army and Micaiah's army as the two sort of like generations of Radiant Dawn. It's slightly more complicated because of how things interweave and the existence of Valencia's little scrubs, but at the end of the day, Lyre is neither late joining or high growth. She just has bad bases and she's a joke unit. Stop trying to make her an Est. And on the topic of not being late joining, I am going to go ahead and say the caveat that I personally consider Ests to be late joiners, so any of the early joining characters such as Donal and Anna I think are automatically discounted from being Ests, at least under my definition. Personally, I view Ests and Trainees as 2 separate archetypes, so if you're interested in my thoughts in any of these units, I made an entire video about Trainees, which will be linked below. Of course, there is one early joiner that I have to ask about, and that's Flayn. I got 7 people submitting Flayn, and I'm just confused because I can't see any relation that she has to Est herself or the Est archetype. She joins relatively early, and her growths are actually pretty bad. I guess as an enemy, she's a Pegasus rider, but 3 houses doesn't constrain people to specific classes. And as a blue unit, she starts out in the priest class. The closest thing I can think of is that if you raise her white magic, she eventually gets rescue, but that doesn't feel like an SD thing, just raising the ranks through tutoring. And also, she starts at C+ white magic, so she's not even that far away from her movement skill. I got more comments about Flayn than any other not included unit, so there's definitely at least a small contingent of people who consider her to be an Est, but I don't understand why. I really would like an explanation. If there's only one unit whose explanation gets shed light on by this video, I want it to be her, because she's the one that confuses and baffles me the most. While there are others that seem like wild stretches, I can at least see the thin threads connecting them. For example, Cormag is a flyer who joins about 2/3 of the way through the game. I mean, his bases are good, he's not a low base, high growth unit, he's just a flyer who joins 2/3 of the way of the game, and that doesn't make him an Est on its own, but I can at least understand why people would say that about him. I mean, sure, he joins with an Elysian Whip that he's either ready or practically ready to use depending on your route, but at least he's a flyer who's one use command away from being a pre-promote. And that's more than I can say about Noel, a unit who is begging to use the Chapter 15 Master Seal, or a Guiding Ring from the map if you went Ephraim route. His growths aren't any good either. Only his HP and magic are what I would call acceptable. I mean, 40% skill is okay, I guess, but most of his hit rate problems come from Dark Tomes, rather than his skill stat. And the 0 luck with a 20% luck growth is just laughable. This unit is not trying to be trained, but that's okay because his stats don't actually matter. If you promote him and want to use him, you probably want to send him Summoner. There he can make decoys for you and his stats don't matter, therefore his growths don't matter, but his growths are bad. Speaking of bad growths, when is the last time you've taken a look at FE5 Shanam in Oifibot? Because if you think he's an Est, you probably should look at his page again. Not only is he not a good growth unit, but he's also a pre-promote, which doesn't really line up with the training project philosophy. Yes, if you wanted to, you could throw scrolls on him and give him good growths, but he doesn't have them on his own, so it doesn't count. You can put scrolls on anyone. If you want a unit with even worse growth than Shanam who cannot be fixed by scrolls, it's FE11 Bantu, which is why I have no idea why he was submitted by 3 people. Although it might be a joke regarding the fact that I said FE12 Bantu is the worst unit in all of Fire Emblem. Anyway, FE11 Bantu has 10% in almost all of his growths, although he has 20% in strength, 20% in skill, and a whopping 40% in HP. People meme on Shadow Dragon growths as being incredibly low, and that's sometimes true, but even by those standards, Bantu has really bad growths, like worse growth than generics. Bantu isn't the only Manakit that got submitted, however. A lot of them did, and so many that I think I'm going to have to make their own section about them, so yeah, let's dive into that. Part 7. This is now a video about the Tiki archetype. So, cards on the table, I don't actually think the Tiki archetype is a real thing. I recognize that there are many Fire Emblem games that have Manakit characters, but these characters often perform wildly different roles both in the story and gameplay, and to me it feels like they're just being lumped together as an archetype because they are in the same class, in a similar vein to people who refer to the first Armor Knight as the Doga archetype, or the first Archer as the Gordon archetype. If the only thing a group of units has in common with each other is their starting class, then I don't think that's enough connectivity to refer to them as an archetype. So if the reason you're invested in my channel is that you thought I would eventually talk about Tiki in my archetype series, this is probably the closest you're going to get. FE11 Tiki has worse bases and better growths than FE11 Ests does. However, this isn't the full picture. First off, she gets significant stat boosts from equipping her Divine Stone, meaning that her functional base strength is actually 13 and her functional defense is 18, etc, etc. In combination with the weapon's 18 might, it's hard to view Tiki as a unit in need of a training mark, especially because the Divine Stone only has 30 uses, and they're in limited supply, you can't just get them in the armory. I think there might be a secret shop that sells some, but other than that, Tiki has a limited number of attacks she can partake in. But that's okay because honestly the most important attack is the one that she can do at base, and that is killing the final boss. Well, technically it's 2 attacks, you have to use the Alm Staff to revive her and let her suicide and all this fun stuff, but yeah, Tiki is perfectly capable of accomplishing her most important job because she deals effective damage to the final boss, a trait shared only by Myrrh, who will die if he initiates combat on even the middling hard difficulties, such as hard 3 and above. While there are other ways to kill Menace, the most free one is to warp Tiki over to him, have her attack and die on retaliation, then use the Alm Staff to revive her and warp her over again, have her attack and finish him off this time. It's more than a little bit fucked up of Myrrh to order a little girl to suicide just so he can complete his holy war, but it is definitely an iconic moment. And because that is her most iconic moment, I find it incredibly difficult to consider her an Est. Again, this is something she does at base, and it is probably the best job for her. Training her up to be a combat unit is unrewarding, because you can't forge the Divine Stone, and it has limited uses outside of the potential secret shop that I can't find information confirming or denying, TBH. One game that I know has a secret shop with Dragon Stones is FE12, although you can only access it on the lower difficulties because the highest difficulty modes take away your Warp Staff and you need to use Warp to reach that secret shop. FE12 is an interesting game. I'll be the first to admit, FE12 is not the game that I know the most about. However, Tiki does not appear to be an Est in that game either. The Divine Stone still hits dragons for effective damage, but won't hit the final boss, Menace, and as a result, she kind of lacks a niche as she joins after most of the dragons you're going to fight are already behind you. Her growths are as impressive as they were in the previous game, but she lacks the Zero to Hero arc that I would associate with Ests. There's definitely a stronger case for her here than there is in FE1 where she can do a lot of things at base, but at the end of the day, I would still say that it's a bit of a stretch. This same logic basically applies to FE3. I could understand why some people say she's an S based on join time and growth rates, but I think holistically, I'm going to lean closer to no. One final variant of Tiki that was suggested a few times is the adult version that shows up in Awakening, and I'll be honest, I don't understand the logic here. Her growths are, I mean, they're good by modern standards, but they're kind of just average for Awakening. 130 HP is definitely great, but 60% strength, 45% magic, 55% skill, 50% speed, 80% luck, 60% defense, and 60% res, like, these numbers all sound impressive, but it's important to remember that this is Awakening. They're only 5 to 10% more than the growths of Frederick, the game's Jagan. Tiki also joins at a very high level, with respectable base stats for her join time. In fact, in my 0% growths playthrough of Awakening, I went out of my way to play the optional difficult map in order to recruit her, because I considered her to be so necessary for the late game route maps that it was worth my time and energy. While we're here, I'll briefly talk about Naui and Na, because they were also submitted several times. And yeah, these units also have fairly average growths for Awakening. Again, they are high, but they're not so high as to blow you out of the water. Naui actually joins early enough that I would discount her from being an Est on join time alone. However, I also think from the experience of growing her and her bases, she's not so much behind what you would expect the Awakening units to be that I would count her as an Est. Awakening has a very bad habit of handing you units who are slightly behind the people you've trained, and I would say that Naui falls into that category. As for Na, she's in a bit of a weird place as a Generation 2 unit. Her base stats and growth rates are not fixed and instead depend on her parentage. Her join time is also highly variable because she comes from a paralog that only unlocks based on getting Naui and Est support. As a result, you could very well make her a build your own Est by unlocking her paralog only 4 or 5 maps before the endgame and then uber training her up, or you could get her as early as Chapter 13, at which point she slots into your army basically on par with everyone else. Again, she follows the rule of being slightly behind, but not so much that I would consider her to be massively underleveled. As a result, I struggle to call her an Est, because while you definitely can choose to make her one, that is the result of a conscious choice of the player, rather than an inherent aspect of her design. And to be clear, I think that this applies to basically every Gen 2 Awakening unit. I wouldn't call any of them Ests, but I can understand kind of why someone else might. Since I got multiple submissions for Morgan, I am going to take this opportunity to slot them into probably not an Est alongside Na. Jumping backwards to the GBA Manicheats, Fa is FE6's resident #Tiki archetype. Ugh, I feel so cringe just saying that. Fa has incredibly good growths and shaky bases, although the bonuses from her Divine Stone definitely improve them. However, she only has 30 durability in her Divine Stone, meaning that there's not really an incentive to train her, because if you do, she's not usable because the Divine Stone breaks. You can't purchase any others, and you can't repair it with the Hammer'n staff, so she's kind of stuck in this weird situation where you don't super want to use her, because if you do, then you're no longer allowed to use her. The biggest niche that people find for her is using her as a status staff baiter, because enemies don't see the res bonus the Divine Stone gives, and therefore think they're attacking someone with 6 resistance, but instead attack someone with double-digit resistance instead. It's not much, but it's honest work. Or I guess dishonest work because she's lying to the AI. Either way, it's not much. I've already talked about Myrrh. I removed her from the tier list at some point just to Mandela affect the audience, but she belongs in definitely on an Est as well. She's competent at base, so if you're curious about that, rewind the video to the competent at base section. I'm not going to say the same thing twice in the same video. Well, that last part is actually a lie, because the things I have to say about the Teleus Dragons are remarkably similar to each other. FE9 Enna joins you near the end of the game. Her bases are incredibly shaky for that point, but they are technically workable, as I saw in 0% growths. Her growths, on the other hand, are pretty bad. 145% HP is very good, and 60% speed is definitely workable, but everything else is kind of abysmal, and she only has 10 levels to grow, so bad growths plus not much time to grow means that she's not an Est. In Radiant Dawn, Enna joins near the very end of the game, with bases that are shaky but arguably workable, although I would say they're not especially workable. The biggest thing she brings to the table is Blood Type, to boost people adjacent to her. Her growth rates are kind of abysmal. They cut her HP growth down to 50%, and everything else is pretty awful as well. She does have a 50% magic growth, which I guess would be halfway decent if she could use any magical weapons, but unfortunately, since she is a red dragon, her damage is calculated using strength, and her base of 10 and her 20% growth rate are not especially impressive, either from a bases or growths perspective. She's level 22, so she doesn't have any sort of accelerated experience gain, and her growths are terrible. This unit is not an Est. Kurthnaga is a black dragon who joins near the end of the game. He has shaky bases, although admittedly his bases are better than Enna. His growths are also slightly better than Enna, although not so much that I would consider them to be standout. His two highest growths are 95% HP and a 60% luck. Everything else is hovering around 45, 35, or 25. The biggest thing that he brings to the table is Night Tide, which boosts the defenses of people adjacent to him. It's weaker than Blood Tide because you want to boost offenses more than you do defenses, but it is definitely something you can use, especially if you're playing slowly. He joins at level 20, meaning that he has some room to grow, but not that much. It's only 2 levels lower than Enna, who joins at the same time as him. This unit is also not an Est. I told you it would be repetitive, didn't I? Radiant Dawn units are very weird from a design perspective, and the cast is incredibly unbalanced. As a result, a lot of people join with stats significantly lower than you would expect someone who joins around their time to have. The knee-jerk reaction is to label these units as Ests, however they really are not. It's simply that Radiant Dawn's cast is almost as poorly designed as Revelations' cast. Some units are just bad, and we need to accept that bad bases does not necessarily mean good growths. In fact, let's take this opportunity to talk about the remaining Radiant Dawn units on the list. Part Radiant Dawn, the units from Fire Emblem 8. So, the two Secret Stones units that I haven't spoken about yet are Marissa and Ewan, and honestly, I actually think there's decent arguments for both of them being Ests. I'll start with Marissa because I think that case is a little bit shakier, however. Marissa joins you in Chapter 10 of Erica Route or Chapter 12 of Ephraim Route, and I think in Erica Route she can't rightly be considered an S, she's just a low-level unit who joins alongside some other low-level units. Like, the existence of the Tower of Valny means that join level in Sacred Stones is always very wacky. In Ephraim Route, however, she joins just late enough that I would say she can qualify as an S, and she has stats that are lower than Joshua's bases. However, if you compare their growths, and honestly her growths to anyone in your army, you'll find that she is about on average growths-wise. As a result, I think that she falls into the camp of being just another under-leveled unit. I'm sorry, Crimson Flash, I really tried to fight for you, but you really belong and definitely not an Est. Ewan, on the other hand, is an interesting case. On the surface, he has all of the same attributes as the other people and definitely not an Est. Yes, he has a low level and low bases, but his growths are not phenomenal. However, he starts out in the trainee class, so he's definitely a lower level than even the scrubs like Marissa and La Rochelle who join around him. And while I would typically consider the fast experience gain but low stat growths to be the indicator of not actually an Est, I actually think Ewan is probably an Est. Not because of anything he gets from his stat growths, they're all pretty horrendous, but the fact that he has access to the Summoner class. Summoners are an incredibly powerful class capable of giving you endless supplies of lightning rod decoys to try to AI manipulate. It is definitely slightly overrated, if only because FE8 is an easy enough game that they're kind of unnecessary, but it is a cool thing and it is a payoff for the training arc, and at the end of the day, that fits into what I've been talking about, with Ests not necessarily needing to be incredibly powerful, but the payoff to the training arc is what makes it worthwhile. As a result, I think I'm going to place Ewan as the very first unit in probably an Est. Part 8. Ranking the characters in Radiant Dawn. I'm starting to think that the more I work on the S video, the more I lose my mind. Let's try to get through Fire Emblem 10 as quickly as we can. I would discount Vika purely on the basis that she joins early, but it's also worth noting that her growths aren't especially good. So even if you're just looking at the point that she rejoins at the end of Part 4, it's not looking like an S to me. A similar thing could be said about Tormod, although it is also worth noting that Tormod is incredibly good at base when you first get him towards the end of Part 1. Sure, he goes away and then he comes back incredibly underleveled, but he is dominant for one chapter, and he's among your best units for another couple. And honestly, this is more than a lot of Radiant Dawn units have going for them. I know that Tormod gets memed on for being a bad unit, and his Part 4 performance definitely is uninspiring, but he is incredibly important in 2 maps, and he is still quite good in a 3rd. And honestly, that's more than a lot of Radiant Dawn units have going for them. Still, nothing about his kit screams S to me. Let's move on. Skrymir is an interesting pick. He has incredibly competent stats with only 2 less strength and 5 less speed than Gifka, who is considered almost an automatic pick for the tower, and he joins a couple of maps beforehand, so if you want to train him up you can. His growths are not especially impressive, at 35% in most relevant areas, and his bases are very impressive, so on the surface this feels like the spitting image of not an Est. But I do think there is an argument to be made that the most important portion of training him is getting him a strike rank from S to SS. I still don't think that this makes him an Est, it's a pretty big stretch, but it's honestly a better Est candidate than a lot of people who got submitted on this list, and even some commonly accepted Ests such as Zeiss and Sarah. I don't think those are Ests, have I made that clear enough yet? At the end of the day, I still think his base stats are far too close to Gifkas to land him anywhere other than definitely not an Est, but it is certainly an interesting perspective to be brought up, and it made me think quite a bit after looking at this submission. Sanaki is in a similarly weird situation. Her base stats are actually pretty good, and she's going to be performing better than most of your trained mages, but she still needs a little bit of training to be competent enough for the tower. She starts as a level 1 Empress, which is treated like a tier 3 class, so she's not under-leveled for the time, but you do definitely benefit from sinking experience into her as she is forced into the tower, and having someone who can hit on res is good for the various barriers of Ashura that are on the plus defense tiles. Still, at the end of the day, I think she is too close to competent at base to count as an Est. I mean, even in 0% growth, she is useful for taking on the high-res, low-defense units. Her biggest downside is that she is squishy, but this is nothing new to mages, even pre-promoted ones. And her 30% defense growth isn't going to change that anytime soon. Last but not least, we have Peleus, a unit who is locked to New Game Plus, and who I think is most often heralded as the Est of this game, and I gotta be honest, I don't see it. While it is absolutely true that he is the most tragically underleveled unit in Radiant Dawn, joining as a tier 2 in part 4, so close to the end of the game, and partway through the map, so you can't even give him bonus experience. At the end of the day, his growths just are not enough to justify training him. Like, 55% magic is hilariously bad. Soren has 80% magic. The two biggest appeals that Peleus offers are his 60% speed growth, meaning that it is very possible for him to be your fastest Arcsage, and his access to dark magic, which is basically exclusive to him. As though there is technically another unit who has a dark rank, they are functionally not going to be able to use dark magic. This means that he has exclusive access to 2 separate 5-use siege tomes, and honestly, that's a really cool approach to a unit. It's one of the reasons why I like using him in every single playthrough, but I would never consider him to be an Est, as this is something that he once again offers you basically from base. Sure, you could train him to improve his magic and therefore allow him to deal more damage with these siege tomes, but the same could be said for almost every unit that is able to accomplish specific jobs at base. Every unit in Fire Emblem benefits from level ups. Just because that's true doesn't make them an Est. Due to how severely underleveled he is, I am going to say that Peleus has the strongest argument for anyone to be an Est, but I still don't think he is one. I'll put him in probably not an Est just to throw Peleus fans a bone, but honestly, we really need to stop calling this unit an Est. Checking back in on the Ests tier list, and oh, I missed Fiona over there. I guess you could make the argument that she technically joins kind of late because it's late into part 1 and you only have 3 Dawn Brigade chapters after that, and I can see it, but it feels like a pretty huge stretch. Like, holistically, she's not an late game unit. She joins in part 1 of a 4-part game. I'm gonna put her in probably not an Est because I can see how you could do some huge mental gymnastics to say that she ends up as a late joiner because there's only a couple of maps left in part 1 and then you only have 3 maps you can use her in part 3 and yada yada yada. I don't buy it. It feels like copium, but I get it. And with that out of the way, I think we're finally ready to move out of Radiant Dawn. And right back into Peleus, because I have a lot of characters from Path of Radiance I need to talk about, either because they got submitted or because I included them on the poll. I'll try to make these go quick. Despite being in a class that is functionally a promoted class, Alencia's 80% magic growth in combination with her kind of sad 12 base magic, and the fact that she benefits from this magic growth both through staffing and through magical swords if you can get her sword rank up, means that I feel comfortable saying that she is at least probably an Est. Despite her promoted status, her EXP gain is still faster than most of your army since they'll be around level 15 promoted when she joins. And while the payoff isn't necessarily a good combat unit, she is at the very least able to do flying Kanto staff stuff. While Shannon has low basis and high growths for his join time, he's also around on par with other units for his join time, so he's not going to get the accelerated XP gain I would expect from Ests. Still, everything other than that kind of checks out and passes the vibe test, so I think he's closer than a lot of other units on this list. I think it's a bit of a stretch still, but I honestly am more convinced than I thought I would be when people submitted Shannon to me as a possible Est. While it is true that Tormod starts underleveled for his join time, if we compare him to his fellow mages Ilyana and Soren, we'll find that he has worse growth than both of them. The biggest thing that Tormod has to offer is that he has celerity, giving him +2 movement, which is definitely nice, especially considering that mages and Tellius have Armor Knight movement, but I don't think it makes him an Est. You could theoretically make the argument that celerity is similar to the summoner utility that Ewan has to offer, however, I think the fact that he starts with celerity counteracts that point. It is definitely a subjective judgment, but this is my tier list, so I'm going to put him in definitely not an Est. Astrid starts out underleveled and bowlocked, which is quite unfortunate, but she has Paragon in order to catch up to and surpass your other paladins in a timely manner, even if you're not using bonus experience. In my opinion, the biggest thing that holds her back from Estdom is that she joins fairly early, about a third of the way through the game. It's not quite as early as people like Donal or Ross, but it is still, to my mind, too early to fully consider her an Est. The existence of Paragon is enough to elevate her to probably an Est, but no higher. Last but not least, Soth from Path of Radiance is a level 1 unit who joins around the same time as Astrid, has incredibly good growths, incredibly bad bases, and the Blossom skill to elevate his good growths even more. However, he is also a thief, and therefore his stats basically don't matter. Like, strength and speed are functionally important for stealing from units, but Soth is also stuck in the Thief class. He can't promote to Assassin, unlike the game's other Thief, Volk, so there's not even really payoff for training him. You get a worse version of Volk, who also can't promote. It's really sad. I don't think this unit can be considered an Est, because the biggest thing he contributes is stealing vulneraries and opening chests, and both of those can be done at base. In fact, a lot of the stealables that he wants to do can be done at base. That being said, theft in Path of Radiance is a little bit overrated anyway. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video, but I see it praised as this like high benchmark of utility, but it's kind of not. Like, Path of Radiance thieves, they're flashy, but they're super unnecessary and not especially helpful. I think that speed round finishes off Tellius though. Let's check back in on the list. This is where we are at, and this is who we have left. You know what? Fuck it. We do it live. Look, this video is already going to be long enough. Let's just speedrun some of these. Roche is not an Est. He's a pre-promoted paladin with shitty stats. That's all there is to it. Medea is also a pre-promoted paladin with shitty stats. And Sheena, well, she's a pre-promoted armor with shitty stats. She has pretty good growths, but she joins as a pre-promote at the time that you would expect people to be promoted. I'm gonna say it's a bit of a stretch. It's a big stretch, actually. It's a big stretch. It's a bit of a stretch. I think she's in the same boat as Shannon, basically. Everything I said about Shannon, apply that to her. Silver Snow Cyril. This is just a, I guess functionally he ends up sort of being that, but this is the result of someone who's meant to be a trainee, although functionally kind of isn't, being recruited later as a result of the way that Silver Snow's recruitment is weird with him and Catherine and Hilda. I'm gonna go ahead and put him in probably not an Est. I think that you could make the argument, and it's definitely like high growth, slow bases, but he gets auto leveled as well. So it's not like he's like under leveled, right? Like, he gets auto leveled, just that his like growths, because he grows in the commoner class, his growths suck while he's being auto leveled, and as a result his bases kind of suck. But like his growths are still, yeah, I don't know. I don't think Cyril counts as an Est even in Silver Snow. I think that Catherine even less so. Like, I don't know. I don't know. I've seen her referred to as an Est. I put her on the poll as a result of that, but like, she's not. And neither is Hilda. And people seem to agree with me, by the way, about these two not being an Est, so that's good. Leaf and Lachesis are kind of like, I talked about them in the trainee video. They're kind of like, they benefit specifically from promotion rather than growths, which is where you want to be in FE4, because everyone in FE4 has really high growth, so it's hard to be an Est based on growths in FE4. I think they both joined too early to be considered an Est. I consider them to be trainees. I talk about them in the trainee video. But the logic of making them trainees does carry over to Ests if you consider them to both be the same archetype. I'm going to go ahead and put them in definitely not an Est on the same grounds as everything I said about like Donald and Ross and Amelia and those types of people. But if you personally think that join time's not important, then feel free to merge those two, those ones. Delthea and Jessie and, well, Sonia's definitely not Nest. I don't know where the fuck this comes from. Multiple people submitted that, but like she's just a weaker choice on the Aaron versus Samson, right? Like she's obviously lower level than Dean, and I guess maybe that's why like she's unpromoted whereas he's promoted, but I just don't see it. Her growths are not Est growths, and her bases are like they're passable. She's not Nest. But in terms of Jessie and Delthea and Tatiana, Tatiana and Jessie and Delthea are in this weird situation where like, how much of an Est can you actually be in a game like Gaiden or SOV where class bases exist? Especially because Delthea has Aura at base. I think she is a big stretch because, like, yes, her stats kind of suck and her growths are amazing, and so I can see how you arrive there, but Aura at base means that she's still, like, nuking people, right? Like, she's kind of just a glass cannon. It makes me think of Lilina, but joining later. Jessie and Tatiana, like, I think it's a bit of a stretch for both of them. Well, Tatiana actually starts at a fairly high level. I think I'm going to put them both in a bit of a stretch, though. I think that in a game like SOV, where, like, the class bases are a thing, and does Jessie even really have good growths? Actually, Jessie doesn't even really have good growths, does he? I'm going to go ahead and put him in probably not Nest, especially because he didn't join that late either. Like, it's in the desert fort. Yeah, no, this guy's not Nest. What the fuck am I talking about? Tinny and Tiltu, like, they definitely are under leveled at the time, and Linda. Like, these are all just gonna be lumped in the same area, right? Because they're definitely under leveled. But the benefit is, like, Wrath as opposed to Bonkers growths, because especially in Gen 2, everyone has Bonkers growths. So, like, for these two in particular. Actually, I think it's this way around. Yeah, it's this way around. I don't know why I had them lumped together like that. But yeah, especially for these two, like, everyone has bonkers growths in Gen 2, so having good growth isn't really a standout. Even Tiltu doesn't have, like, great growths compared to the rest of the cast. I'm going to say probably not an Est. I can see how someone might reach putting them in Est, but it's just, I don't think that's the case. Also, I should put Jessie, FE2 Jessie in not Nest as well, because it's the same logic as regular Jessie, right? Like regular Jessie, SOV Jessie. Sophia's growths are fucking abysmal. Sophia's growths are fucking abysmal. Well, they're not fucking abysmal, but they're like, honestly, I think Hugh makes a better argument for S than Sophia. I'm gonna go put her in definitely not Nest, and him in probably not Nest, but I could see this just because she is so under-leveled. But I think if there's no payoff to it, like, oh, you know, she has a decent magic growth, but it's not like, you know, Lilina has a better magic growth than her, right? So, like, it's not like it's like, oh my god, like, she's blowing the other growth units out of the water. Like, no, it's not. She's not. Carla is a pre-promote. Like, she's a shitty pre-promote, but she's not a growth unit. She is a joke unit. Like, the joke is the whole thing where, like, you train one shitty unit in order to get another one. It's a fun little meme. Nyx. Oh, this is about to shrink everything down, isn't it? I'm gonna knock the rankables out of the picture with my formatting. Not Nest. Rev is just unbalanced. Charlotte, I think it's a big stretch. I've actually heard the logic, and it's like, in a vacuum, it's kind of convincing. You know, she joins at a lower level than Benny alongside him, and she's got that massive strength growth, and, you know, you do get rewarded for training her with a high-strength berserker or whatnot, but she's only 5 levels under Benny. It's at the tail end of the time where unpromoteds would be joining you, but she's not so under-leveled that it, like, stands out. She will be a lower level than the rest of your army, probably, but, like, you know, you just got Laszlo and Perry in the previous map. Like, I can see it, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's wrong, but I do think it's a stretch. Jake, I'm gonna go ahead and put him in. It's a bit of a stretch, because FE12 is a game that I'm not super familiar with, but having seen the argument that, like, so this is FE12 Jake, not Ballistician Jake. having seen the argument that, like, his bonkers growths, in combination with, you know, like, being a pre-promote, joins around the mid-game, you train him into something good, like, I see it. I think it's a bit of a stretch, though, but I might be wrong. He just doesn't seem like the sort of unit who is a training project. He's kind of just a filler unit with good growths, which maybe that's me being pedantic, but... Rad is not an Est. Corel is not an Est, although he has a better argument than these two for being an Est, just because he does have those massive growths, but he's level 19, like, get out of here. Fear, I think, joins too early, and I guess before we talk about the Rosado in the room, because I do want to do an entire segment on Rosado, I will just sort of address the 3 tiering Saga characters. I don't think any of them are Ests. I know Latenna starts with Paragon and Rebecca gets it upon level up, and Lena has that 10% movement growth, which is very funny. But she's also got 10% strength growth. Like, she's a joke character. Her movement growth is tied with her strength growth. She's a joke character. Like, if she's under-leveled, you could make that case, I guess. I've seen people say Hagar is an Est as well, and I don't think that that's the case either. Yeah, none of these are Ests. Sorry, Tiering Saga does not really have an Est character. Hagar's probably the closest one. But, like, Lena's a joke character. Rebecca and Latenna are kind of like the most convoluted Aaron versus Samson in the series history. Yeah, I don't think they're Ests. I don't even know anymore. Rosado. Rosado and I have a bit of a history. I actually did an entire video about his characterization, which got his voice actor to join my Discord, which is the single coolest thing that has ever happened to me as a YouTuber. The Discord is linked below, by the way, if you are interested. But while Rosado is a very good character, I think he ends up being a pretty bad unit. And it's a shame because I think most of his issues are tied to the fact that he's in Engage and some of the choices Engage took with its game structure. I think if you airlifted him and put him in another game, he would still be an alright unit. Nothing spectacular, but he could be decent with a couple of different choices. One of the big things that holds him back is just how free reclassing is in Engage. He's one of only 2 units who starts out in a flying class, and theoretically this could make him a good filler unit. Unfortunately, you can freely reclass anyone into Wyvern or Griffin, and there's a lot of people who want to go into those roles. Kagetsu, Pandreo, Lapis, Diamant, the list goes on. Basically anyone who doesn't want to be a warrior wants to be a wyvern, and some people want to be both. Since all you need are 2 physical weapon ranks, it's not that hard for most people to access at base, and the ones who can't are only a few SP from being able to reach wyvern. So instead of being a filler unit that you use because he has flight when no one else does, Rosado ends up being a unit with disappointing bases, but pretty good personal growths. His personal strength growth is 45%, which is actually tied for the highest in the game with Amber and Panette. His personal speed growth is also 45%, and that's only 10% lower than Chloe. As a result, just from looking at his bases and growths, Rosado kind of seems like an Est. You're supposed to train him up to get him out of the hole that he starts in, and you'll end up with a very competent unit. Unfortunately for him, his internal level is still quite high, meaning that he gains experience at the same rate as everyone around him. Given the way that Engage's experience is calculated off your internal level, I'm honestly a little bit surprised they didn't give Rosado a lower IL, since this would allow him to be the growth unit he wants to be. Instead, he's stuck growing rather slowly since the experience gain in Engage is, well, it's not especially good. The early game growth units like Anna, Klon, and Alfred suffer from this, but Rosado suffers even harder since he joins much later in the game, and therefore doesn't even get some free utility from what he does in the early game. Like, Alfred isn't a long-term unit, but at the very least he's doing stuff on Chapter 3. Rosado really feels like a victim of all of Engage's systems. The low experience gain means that his growths don't especially matter, the free reclassing means that his base class doesn't especially matter, and his inability to trade or reclass during preps means that he gives an awful first impression. I mean, heck, he's not even able to kill the worm with Erica's Engage attack, despite ostensibly being the tutorial for her. As a result, I can't confidently call Rosado an Est. It's possible he was intended to be one, but many of the aspects of Engage's design just prevent that from being a reality. Which is a shame because our boy deserved better. And with that, I've talked about every unit I need to talk about for this video. So I guess it's time for us to try to move to a conclusion. Trying to find some sort of conclusion from this mess. If you're looking for a meaningful conclusion about whether or not the Est archetype is real and how we would define it, I kinda came to that in the middle of the video. I think the term can serve as a good shorthand in conversations for talking about units as long as it is not used so broadly as to be applicable to every single unit that joins late with bad bases. After all, sometimes bad units are just bad, and they're not secretly growth projects. A more interesting thing to explore perhaps is why so many characters keep getting labeled as Ests even when they don't have too many similarities to them. And I think it's in an effort to defend units that they like. Not because they're trying to claim that they're a good unit, but that claiming a unit is an Est conveys a certain level of fun and enjoyment to using them. Think about it. Juno from Fire Emblem 6 is a late-game joiner with extremely pathetic stats who is just not fun to use. Sure, she can do some rescue drops, and she's theoretically better than a lot of units who are Ests, however, she's just unrewarding. You don't get that zero to hero, that dopamine rush of all the stats going up. However, no Fire Emblem unit is truly universally hated, and as a result, Juno, and the units that are like her, have fans. And those fans will sometimes label them as Ests because they are underpowered late-joining units who those people enjoy using. I believe that they recognize the unit is bad at base, but just assume that they must be able to grow well. After all, this is a unit that they enjoy, and they don't want them to be unsalvageable by any means. Due to the fact that there is no way to check in-game growth rates, they assume that this unit must have high growths. After all, why else would they show up so late with such underwhelming bases? And this is doubly the case if that unit ended up getting lucky for them in their playthrough. Kurth Naga does not have particularly impressive growths, but if you bonus experience abuse him, he can turn out well. If you get lucky rolls, Marissa can end up with better stats than Joshua, despite the fact that her averages are worse. There are countless examples like this, and as a result, countless units end up feeling like Ests to individuals in their individual playthroughs. As for why Ests exist to begin with, I think it's similar to trainees. In my video, The Problem About Trainees, I talked about how they often end up disappointing and usually worse than their counterparts. For example, Ross is usually worse than a trained Garcia or Dosla. However, one aspect that I overlooked a little bit is that the point isn't for them to end up as a strong unit when trained. The point is the training itself. Neither Ests nor trainees are designed to be good units. They're designed to be fun. And honestly, I think from that perspective, they're pretty universally successful. Like, one of my favorite Fire Emblem experiences was training Josie in Call of the Armor, and as a result, I train her every single run. My friend Casual Jacob goes B route on Thracia specifically in order to get Miranda and train her. At the end of his streamed FE7 playthroughs, Imported Cheese said that Nino is his favorite unit in the game to use. And even Akira Su, the worst YouTuber on the platform, enjoys using some Ests. Honestly, Ests serve a purpose in both easy and hard Fire Emblem games. If the game is easy, training an Est is a way to inject some difficulty into an otherwise bland game. And if the game is hard, then training them is a source of pride and accomplishment, with the screenshot of them one-rounding the final boss being the proverbial pink Darth Vader. So no, Ests are not best, but that kind of was never the point. They're fun, so you should try using one on your next playthrough. Unless it's Zeiss, because Zeiss is not an Est, and that is the main takeaway of this video. I made this entire video to prove that Zeiss is not an Est. Thank you and goodbye. So this is by far the most time and effort that I've had to put into any single video, and it wouldn't have been possible if I didn't have the support of all of my wonderful patrons. So I want to thank every single one of you. The pre-promotes, Jamie Collins, Maren Karen, Thick Molder, George Granville the 7th PM, Daniel Kalaskas, Anya, Tailored Muffton, Dr. Majalis, Herc, SUP, Gabe the Green, and Michaela Bozeman get their names read out every single week. However, I also want to give a shout out to Isabella Star, Gameboo, Fyrant, Emery Lafur, Archangel Everlasting as my growth units. They don't get shouted out every single week, but I feel bad not acknowledging them, and this was a very big video, so it feels appropriate. Also, I want to give a double special thank you to Michaela Bozeman, because they were supporting me last week as well, but unfortunately I had already recorded that video far in advance and didn't have time to edit their name in, just because I was working so hard on this one. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link below. There's a number of benefits attached to it, including the ability to vote on polls to influence the channel, as well as early access to certain videos, and cat pictures is the big one. I send a lot of cat pictures. But obviously, don't support me if you're not financially able to. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem videos. I really, really appreciate everyone who does support. It makes me feel like awesome and special that so many people are willing to support all of my Fire Emblem videos, but please don't, like, you know, go broke supporting them. It's just video games. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much for watching this video and making it to the end. Bye-bye.